Hi there. Today we'll be talking about industrial and corporate growth and the changes in the American class system that accompanied them. These are all big ideas that lasted a long time, but they all took place during at least part of the Gilded Age, a period in American history which lasted from about 1870 to around 1900. It's hard to put a bow on 30-odd years of history, which is one reason, perhaps, why historians' debates about this time period sometimes seem a bit slippery. But if you want two hallmarks of the age, two things that most everyone agrees on, they are these. First, the Gilded Age was a time of enormous economic and technical growth and innovation, a time when steel and oil became crucial drivers in the economy, when cities were electrified and plumbing went indoors, when railroads crossed the country and telephones started to connect people to each other by voice. And second, and probably related to that huge spurt of technological innovation and economic growth, it was a time of gross inequality, where the rich became much richer than they had been before, and the poor, if they didn't become poorer, although they might have, became a much larger segment of the population than they had been before, making the divide between rich and poor seem much more dire than it had been. Historians' debates about the Gilded Age have often focused on that last divide between the poor people, see, I'm writing poor here, see how that works? Especially workers, and industry, and the people whom all that industry enriched, see, I'm writing rich right across their bellies, industrialists, and other very wealthy members of society. But there is often a third element to those debates, and that's, you'll see what happens when I write it, government. See, it takes longer to write government than to say it. That's government and politics. So a lot of the arguments about the Gilded Age focus on how these groups or institutions related to each other. And the context for these arguments is the question of American exceptionalism. Exceptionalism simply means the idea that something is exceptional, that the normal rules apply to it, or that it's different from everything else around it. You can get an idea of that in this painting from 1872. We don't need to analyze everything about it, but it's pretty obvious that America must be pretty special if it's got a weird ghost lady leading its settlers west. It's not like weird spectral ghost ladies lead Belgian people across Europe. The question of American exceptionalism comes up frequently both in history and today. You still hear politicians declaring today that America is the greatest, best, most specialist, sparkliest, shiniest countryest ever, and it can be applied to a lot of different contexts. But for the Gilded Age, the key question is why America's class politics seem to have been different from Europe. The Gilded Age is a great, although hardly the only, testing ground for American exceptionalism, because in Europe, very similar developments to those in America, rapid industrialization, growing inequality, led to the growth of permanent socialist parties. That was in England and in France. In Russia and elsewhere, actual socialist revolutions took place, in which workers and their allies wreaked violent ruptures in the social and political fabric in the name of equality. Whatever happened in America, it wasn't quite that. America has no major class-based political parties, and has never been able to sustain them for much time, and even in moments of great inequality, there has never been anything close to a class-based revolution. For the Gilded Age, historians have come up with a number of possible reasons for this. One theory historians have proposed is known as the consensus school, which was intellectually powerful especially during the Cold War. This was a theory that applied to lots of eras, not just the Gilded Age, but for our purposes, these historians suggested that Americans generally shared certain values, and that those values kept them from degenerating into class-based conflict. Instead, there was general consensus, see, there's the name of the school, about what would be good for America and its people. And that consensus, or agreement, was what separated America from the division and turmoil of Europe at the time. You can see that narrative here if you look for it. This is the meeting of the Transcontinental Railroad, the laying of the Golden Spike, and it features representatives from up and down the class scale, industrialists and workers all coming together for a common purpose. And you can't see it in this picture, but government is part of this unified purpose too. Government provided a great deal of the funding and land for this and other large-scale industrial projects. If you find evidence in our documents that consensus reigned during the Gilded Age, you might consider what those values were that made that consensus so powerful. What ideas or hopes were powerful enough to keep Americans united in spite of their changed circumstances? But that was not the only theory. A later group of historians, starting in the 1960s and 1970s, argued that historians had gotten the story entirely wrong. According to them, there was no consensus at all, and in fact, America was riven by class conflict. This wasn't just union members asking for better pay either. It was political action by radical workers that manifested itself in a series of violent strikes and group actions, as you can see here with illustrations of large-scale property destruction in the Pullman strike of 1894 and literal bomb throwing at the Haymarket riot of 1886. Despite the failure of workers to form a large-scale political party, a failure that resulted at least partly from an extraordinarily hostile string of government actions against workers' attempts to unite, their violent and powerful struggle puts America much more in line with the European experience, and much less exceptional. Not that there's anything wrong with that. If you find that this argument matches up with our documents, I'd hope that you would consider what a third school of historians asks, which is why, if laborers were willing to fight for their rights, did they fail? A powerful school of historians suggests, and I'll ask you to think about what evidence might be required to say whether they were right or not, that their failure stemmed from the enduring power of the middle class, if not as a group of people, but as a political or perhaps depoliticized ideal. In the clash between poor factory workers and rich factory owners, the middle class would have been literally the middlemen, managers, accountants, bankers, etc. Here's a picture of a steel factory, with workers in the middle doing hard, dangerous manual labor that required a great deal of strength and manual sophistication. And off to the corner here, I've enlarged him in this slide, is a manager standing removed from the process, observing his workers. This guy and his compatriots, according to the most recent historians of the Gilded Age, would move to the center of the era's story, but their presence seems simultaneously to de-center that story. It was in the late 19th century that the middle class moved literally away from the centers of American cities to the suburbs, hopping aboard carriages and trains and leaving the tumultuous scenes of factories and city squares, where workers faced off with industrialists and their stooges each night. And there was no tumult in the scenes to which they moved, or imagined themselves moving, scenes in which well-dressed families swam about in a world completely removed from outside strife. What role, I'd ask of you, did the middle class play in the Gilded Age, and the struggles, and perhaps failures, of workers to stir up political consciousness? Were they drivers of this, the assault on workers? As managers, they might have had the means. Or were they victims of rich industrialists' drives to consolidate power, left with cultural control but huge measures of social and economic anxiety? Or, finally, swayed by promises of individual wealth, did they simply run away from politics and leave the country to be run by the truly wealthy? The oldest saw in historians' ideas about the Gilded Age is that it was a time of political meaninglessness or apathy. You might consider, as you follow the documents, how effective democratic means could be in combating or abetting rising inequality. Did the values that Americans supposedly shared encourage them to seek equality? Did they encourage them conversely to help people who'd, again supposedly, earn the money they had and not lose their cherished homes? Or did the increasing remove from politics among the middle class relate somehow to earlier questions we've been dealing with, the issues of race or the experience of Reconstruction?